Let's move on now to dissonance control. So in general, when we're working with dissonance control guidelines for three-voice counterpoint, they're going to resemble the two-voice counterpoint dissonance control guidelines as well. And if we follow those, we'll be well on our way to producing idiomatic music in a Baroque style. However, there are a few major changes that we should account for as we're working with three-voice counterpoint. The first of those is the consonant fourth. In general, when we were working with two-voice counterpoint, fourths were typically considered dissonant. They needed to be resolved. However, in three-voice counterpoint, this is not always the case. Only harmonic fourths against the bass need to be resolved. In other words, if you are measuring from the bass voice up to another voice and you produce a fourth, that fourth is considered dissonant. However, if there are fourths in the upper two voices, there is the potential that those could be consonant. Think of this in terms of our first inversion and our second inversion chords. Let's think of a C major chord, C, E, G. If we put that in first inversion, we'd have E, G, C. And the G and the C, those upper two voices, produce a fourth. In the context of a first inversion chord, though, the fourth is in the upper two voices and therefore is consonant. This is why our first inversion chords, when we're creating harmonic progressions, can be used freely, just like we might use root position chords. However, when we get to second inversion chords, so the fifth is in the bass, we'd have G, C, E. The fourth would be against the bass, G up to C. So there we have a dissonant interval against the bass. So that needs to be resolved. That's why our 6/4 chords have to be used so carefully, and we have all of those specific instances and ways of analyzing 6/4 chords. So, harmonic fourths against the bass need to be resolved, but fourths between the upper two voices may be consonant. There are some instances that we'll see where they're dissonant, but just consider that we now have that option, that fourths can be consonant when they're in the upper two voices, particularly when they're in the context of a first inversion triad. Now, the other thing that we have to contend with is that with adding a third voice, we are adding complexity. In two-voice counterpoint, we only had one interval stream to observe. That was the stream of intervals created between the two voices. We had two voices, and that created one stream of harmonic intervals. When we add a third voice, we're not just adding another stream of harmonic intervals. The process is actually additive. We are adding two streams. So we now have the bass voice against the middle voice. That's one stream. And then the middle voice against the soprano. That's another stream. And then we'll also have to contend with the bass voice against the soprano. That's a third stream. So there are three streams of intervals that we have to watch out for as we are creating as we are observing our dissonance control guidelines. Let's take a look at a little passage from Bach's Allein Gott in der Hoseair fugue. This is basically a fugue based on a chorale tune, All Praise to God in Heaven on Earth. So, let's take a look at this passage that I've highlighted here. And we're going to start by just looking at the bass voice and the alto voice. I have created the interval analysis here. We start with G against G, so we've got an octave, a seventh, that's a passing tone, 6, 5, 3, 3, 4, so that's a fourth against the bass, that's going to be a dissonance, and so that's going to be a passing dissonance. Then a sixth, a suspension seventh, going to a 6, and then a 3, and then a stream of thirds. So everything tightly controlled, everything idiomatic to the dissonance control that we learned in two-voice counterpoint. Next, we're going to take a look at the upper two voices, the soprano and alto. I'm ignoring the little grace note there at first, so we just have a third and then a fourth. I haven't put a parenthesis around that, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. 3 to 4, then 5, 6, 8, third, 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 fourth, sixth. I've put a parenthesis around this augmented fourth because it's a dissonance. Now it does resolve to another fourth, and we'll talk about that in a moment. 4, 5, 6. So there is our stream of intervals for the soprano and alto. And we've got one more stream to contend with, the soprano and bass. Here I'm putting it underneath this texture and just labeling it S and B so that I know, so that I don't get confused. So we've got a B in the soprano and then a G in the bass. So we start with a third. We start with a stream of thirds. B against G, A against C, B against D, C against E. Then we go down. We go to a fifth, 6, 8, 3, a passing fourth, and then a 6, and then 6, a passing 7, and then 8. Again, every one of these streams is tightly controlled. There's no use of dissonance that is not idiomatic. Everything can be accounted for within this style and within the techniques that we learned for two-voice counterpoint. Now, the next thing that we should do is provide a harmonic analysis to see how all of this is working together. Now, I have counted some of these intervals as non-chord tones to our harmonic analysis. So this is a bit of a simplified harmonic analysis. I suggested that, first of all, we are in G major and that we begin on a 1 chord. I suggest that these are passing tones that I have circled here in the midst of that 1 chord in the first measure that we're analyzing. However, you could count this as a 2-7, in which case that C would definitely be consonant with the chord. But the fact that we continue on to a 1-6 chord makes me feel that those notes, the A and the C, are incidental. They are ornamenting the passage from a 1 to a 1-6. So then we have what I consider to be a passing note in the middle voice, counting that as a passing tone in the harmony. And then we go up to a 4 chord, moving on to a 5. Now we could consider this next chord a 1-6-4 with some passing notes up above. I choose to hear those as passing tones, but again, it's basically all the same thing. Whether it is a 1-6-4 chord with a passing function, or with passing tone functions up above, or we are counting these as passing tones, it amounts to the same thing. We are ornamenting this movement of 5 to what I hear as a 5-4-2. I still hear that leading tone being present. Moving onwards. Now, you could analyze that. If you wanted to go chord by chord, you could say this is 5, 1-6-4, with maybe those are passing notes or above, or you could consider this having pedal motion in the bass. And then you could consider this a 2-6 chord if you wanted to. That's a slightly strange progression to hear, going from 5 to 2 to a 1 implication. So I do hear that as a 5-4-2, just with that, with some of the chord notes implied from earlier in the measure. And then we go on to this next measure, which again deals with some implications. I'm hearing this as a 1-6 chord with a few passing notes. The A being a suspension wanting to resolve down to the 6, and the E being a passing tone. If you do go chord to chord, though, we technically would have a 3-7, B, A, D, and then we would have a 6-6-4. which seems a little bit odd for the style, which again is why I hear this as a 1-6 with some non-chord tones. And then moving on to a 7 diminished 6, and then a 1-6 with some passing notes. Now, that's there is some sort of filtering out of non-chord tones here that's going on, but what I find interesting about this is the interplay of non-chord tones with the harmonic implication, and the balancing of dissonance control between the voices. Look, for instance, at the opening one chord. We have the G and the B, and then the outer voices go up to the A and the C. The A and a C is a third. That's consonant with each other. However, they're dissonant to the harmonic implication. And this is some of the tension that we will sometimes see, is that voices can be consonant with each other, but dissonant to the harmonic background. And we've seen that in play ever since we first started looking at non-chord tones. Frequently, we would see that non-chord tones, if they occurred simultaneously, would be consonant with each other, but dissonant with the chord. And we see this at play here, that sometimes we will have voices that are consonant with each other, but dissonant with the overall chordal background. And that's one of the nice interplays of tension and release that we can have in three-voice counterpoint. So if we are analyzing three-voice counterpoint, whether it is music that's already written or music that we are writing, this is something that I would highly recommend. Analyze the interval streams and then provide a harmonic analysis. Note where and note what is dissonant and how those dissonances are functioning. That's going to help us write and perform music in a really idiomatic way.